April 29, 1945, the Ruhr Valley, Western Germany. The air smells ash and diesel. A convoy of American trucks rumbles through the shattered streets of a town whose name has been erased by war. Brick dust settles on the shoulders of soldiers who no longer flinch at the sight of rubble. In the back of one of these trucks, a woman sits, with her hands folded in her lap, her wedding ring catching the dim light filtering through the canvas. She is 32 years old. Her name is Marguerite. She wears the tattered uniform of the Reich Arbeitsdienst, the Reich Labor Service, and she has not eaten in 3 days. Her eyes are fixed on the ring, a simple band of gold, the last tangible piece of a life that no longer exists. She does not know where the truck is taking her. She does not know if her husband is alive. She knows only that she is now a prisoner of the Americans and that everything she was told about them was supposed to prepare her for this moment. But nothing did. The truck stops. The canvas flaps open. Sunlight pours in, harsh and unforgiving. An American soldier, no older than 23, extends his hand to help her down. She recoils. She has been taught that the Americans are savages, that they loot and humiliate, that they take everything. She grips the ring tighter, twisting it on her finger as if the motion alone could make it invisible. The soldier sees this. He does not understand German, but he understands fear. He steps back, gestures toward a tent in the distance, and walks away. Marguerite climbs down alone. Her legs tremble. She joins a line of women, all prisoners, all wearing the same expression of braced resignation. They are herded toward a processing tent where American officers sit behind folding tables, surrounded by stacks of paperwork and wooden crates. This is where it will happen, she thinks. This is where they take everything. But the first thing the Americans give her is water. To understand the weight of that moment, the dissonance between expectation and reality, one must first understand what Marguerite had been told and what millions of Germans believed in the spring of 1945. The Nazi propaganda machine, which had spent over a decade constructing a mythology of American decadence and brutality, did not cease its operation even as the Reich crumbled. If anything, it intensified. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, understood that the only way to sustain resistance in the face of inevitable defeat was to make surrender more terrifying than death. And so, in the final months of the war, German civilians and soldiers alike were inundated with images and stories designed to horrify. American soldiers were depicted as racial mongrels, criminals released from prisons to fight, men who raped and pillaged without conscience. Women were told that capture meant defilement, men were told it meant execution, children were told that the Americans ate them. This was not mere exaggeration, it was systematic psychological warfare aimed inward at Germany's own population. Leaflets distributed in the Ruhr Valley in early 1945 warned that American forces would confiscate all personal property, that wedding rings would be pried from fingers, that families would be separated and starved. Radio broadcasts featured fabricated testimonies from survivors of American occupation in France and Belgium, describing scenes of looting and massacre. Newsreels showed staged footage of American soldiers smashing storefronts and dragging women into alleyways. The message was clear. The Americans were not liberators, they were destroyers, and they were coming. Marguerite believed it. Not because she was a fanatic, she had never joined the Nazi Party, had never raised her arm in salute with genuine conviction, but because belief in wartime is less about ideology than survival. When the world is ending, you cling to the narrative you are given, even if it terrifies you, because at least it is a map. At least it tells you what to expect. And so when the Americans arrived in her town and began rounding up members of the labor service, Marguerite hid her wedding ring in her mouth, tucked between her cheek and gum, tasting metal and terror. She had heard the stories. She knew what came next. Except she did not. The processing tent is chaos, but it is organized chaos. American soldiers move with mechanical efficiency, checking names against lists, photographing faces, distributing blankets and tins of food. Marguerite stands in line, her hands shaking. The woman in front of her is older, perhaps 50, her hair gray and thin. She is weeping silently, clutching a small leather purse to her chest. When she reaches the table, an American officer, a lieutenant with tired eyes and a thick Brooklyn accent, asks her a question in broken German. She does not answer. She only opens the purse and removes a gold necklace, placing it on the table as if offering tribute. The lieutenant stares at it, confused. He picks it up, examines it, then hands it back. He says something in English. She does not understand. He mimes putting the necklace around his own neck, then points to her. He is telling her to keep it. She does not believe him. She sets it down again. He sighs, stands, walks around the table, and places the necklace back in her hands. He closes her fingers around it. He says something else, softer this time, and returns to his chair. The woman stares at the necklace, then at him, then at the necklace again. She begins to weep harder. Marguerite watches this. She does not understand it. She feels the ring in her mouth, sharp against her gum, and she wonders if this is a trick, a prelude to something worse. When it is her turn, she steps forward, her heart hammering. The officer at her table is younger, barely out of his teens, with red hair and freckles that make him almost childlike. He asks her name. She gives it. He writes it down. He asks if she has any weapons. She shakes her head. He asks if she is injured. She shakes her head again. He slides a form across the table and tells her to sign it. She cannot read English, but she signs anyway, her hand unsteady. He stamps the form, files it, and then reaches into a crate beside him. He pulls out a chocolate bar and a can of condensed milk. He hands them to her. She stares at them. She does not take them. He sets them on the table in front of her and gestures for her to pick them up. She does not move. He says something in English, gentle and patient, and pushes the items closer. She looks at his face. He is smiling, not cruelly, not mockingly, just smiling, the way a person smiles when they are trying to help. She takes the chocolate bar. She takes the can of condensed milk. She holds them against her chest and walks away, her vision blurring. She does not realize she is crying until she tastes salt. She removes the ring from her mouth, slips it back on her finger, and sits down in the dirt outside the tent. She opens the chocolate bar with trembling hands and takes a bite. It is sweet, impossibly sweet. She has not tasted chocolate in 4 years. She eats slowly, savoring each piece, and she thinks about her husband, about the stories she was told, about the fact that she is still alive and still wearing her ring and still whole. She thinks about the American soldier with the freckles and the smile, and she realizes that she does not understand the world anymore. This was not an isolated incident, it was the pattern. In the spring of 1945, as Allied forces swept through Germany, they encountered millions of displaced persons, prisoners of war, forced laborers, concentration camp survivors, German civilians caught in the collapse. The logistics of this encounter were staggering. The United States Army, unprepared for the scale of human suffering it would face, nevertheless implemented policies designed to manage and care for these populations. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force issued directives requiring humane treatment of all prisoners, regardless of nationality. Food, medical care, and shelter were to be provided. Personal property was not to be confiscated unless militarily necessary. These were not suggestions, they were. In the morning, the women are given breakfast. Not gruel, not stale bread, but oatmeal, sweetened with sugar, served in metal bowls with actual spoons. There is coffee, weak but hot, and canned peaches, syrupy and soft. The women eat in silence, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they are afraid the food will vanish if they move too quickly. Marguerite eats her peaches one slice at a time, savoring the sweetness, feeling the texture on her tongue. She has not tasted fruit in 3 years. She remembers, distantly, a time when such things were ordinary, when a meal like this would have been unremarkable. She remembers her kitchen, the smell of her mother's apfelstrudel, the sound of Klaus laughing at the table. She remembers normalcy. and she realizes with a clarity that makes her chest ache that normalcy is gone. It was destroyed not by the Americans, but by the Reich itself, by the men who promised glory and delivered only ruin. The historical record bears this out. In the months following Germany's surrender, Allied forces faced the monumental task of managing approximately 11 million displaced persons across Europe. Of these, roughly 7 million were in territories controlled by the Western Allies. The United States Army, despite its own supply challenges, allocated significant resources to feeding and housing these populations. By June 1945, American forces were distributing over 4 million rations per day to displaced persons and prisoners of war in Germany alone. This was not an act of charity divorced from strategy. It was understood that starvation and chaos served no one's interests, but it was also not purely transactional. Reports from American officers, letters from soldiers, and oral histories from German civilians consistently describe acts of individual kindness that went beyond official policy. Soldiers sharing their own rations, medics treating German wounded with the same care as American wounded, chaplains organizing efforts to reunite families. These actions stood in stark contrast to the treatment of prisoners in other theaters of the war. On the Eastern Front, German soldiers captured by Soviet forces faced mass executions, forced labor, and starvation. Of the approximately 3 million German prisoners of war taken by the Soviets, over 1 million died in captivity. In the Pacific, Japanese soldiers, indoctrinated with propaganda that depicted American soldiers as barbaric and surrender as the ultimate dishonor, often chose death over capture. When they did surrender, they were frequently shocked by the medical care and food they received, an experience that mirrored, in many ways, the German encounter with American forces in Europe. The reasons for this disparity are complex and multifaceted. American abundance was part of it. The United States simply had more resources to spare. But abundance alone does not produce compassion. Cultural factors mattered as well. The American military, despite its flaws and inequalities, was drawn from a society that valued individualism, rule of law, and, at least rhetorically, human dignity. These values were not always upheld. There were instances of abuse, of looting, of violence, but they formed a baseline expectation that shaped behavior. American soldiers were, by and large, taught to see their enemies as human beings, not as subhuman monsters. This was a profound ideological difference, one that had tangible consequences on the ground. For the Germans, this difference was incomprehensible. They had been raised in a system that defined human worth by race and ideology, that taught them to view the world as a struggle between the strong and the weak, the pure and the degenerate. The Nazi regime had spent over a decade constructing an edifice of propaganda that justified brutality and glorified domination. And now, in the rubble of that regime, they encountered an enemy who fed them, who returned their wedding rings, who treated them with a decency they had been taught was impossible. The cognitive dissonance was not merely uncomfortable, it was existential. It forced them to confront the possibility that everything they had been told, not just about the enemy, but about themselves, was a lie. On her third day in the camp, Marguerite is called to the administrative office. She is told that the Americans are trying to locate her husband. They have lists, they explain, compiled from prisoner of war records and hospital logs. It will take time, but they will search. She does not understand why. She does not understand why the Americans care. An officer, a woman in a crisp uniform with kind eyes, explains through a translator that the International Red Cross is working to reunite families, that this is part of the effort. Marguerite nods, though she does not fully believe it. She has learned not to hope. Hope is dangerous. It hurts too much when it dies. But the officer does something unexpected. She reaches into a desk drawer and pulls out a small notebook and a pencil. She hands it to Marguerite and tells her to write down everything she remembers about her husband, his name, his unit, the last place he wrote from, any identifying details. Marguerite takes the notebook, her hands shaking. She writes slowly, carefully, as if the act of writing itself could summon him back. She writes his name. She writes the date of his last letter. She writes the name of the village where he was born, the scar on his left hand from a childhood accident, the way he hummed when he worked. She fills 3 pages. When she finishes, the officer takes the notebook, reads it, and promises to add it to the search files. She tells her not to give up hope. Marguerite nods again. She does not believe in hope, but she accepts it anyway, the way she accepted the chocolate bar, because it is all she has. That night, she dreams of Klaus. They are in their apartment, before the war, before the world ended. He is sitting at the table, reading the newspaper, and she is making coffee. The sun is streaming through the window. Everything is ordinary. Everything is safe. She wakes to the sound of a truck engine and the smell of diesel, and for a moment she does not remember where she is. Then she sees the barracks, the rows of cots, the women sleeping around her. She touches her wedding ring. She closes her eyes. She tries to hold on to the dream, but it slips away, dissolving like smoke. The object, the wedding ring, becomes the symbol, not because it is inherently significant, but because it is personal, intimate, irreplaceable. In the chaos of war, material possessions lose their meaning. Furniture, clothing, even homes can be destroyed and theoretically rebuilt. But a wedding ring is different. It is not merely an object. It is a promise, a connection, a tangible link to a life that war has tried to erase. When Marguerite hid the ring in her mouth, she was not protecting gold. She was protecting memory, identity, love. And when the Americans allowed her to keep it, they were, whether they realized it or not, affirming her humanity in a way that transcended language and politics. This was not an isolated gesture. Across Germany, American soldiers encountered civilians desperate to preserve the small, fragile pieces of their lives. Photographs, letters, children's toys, and again, wedding rings. The Germans expected these things to be taken. They had been taught that the Americans would loot, that they would strip the defeated of everything, that they would leave nothing behind. But the Americans, by and large, did not. Not because they were saints. Many soldiers did take souvenirs, did confiscate items of value, but because the military as an institution enforced standards that discouraged wanton theft. And because many individual soldiers, confronted with the humanity of their former enemies, chose compassion over cruelty. This choice had consequences. It undermined the Nazi narrative in ways that no amount of counter-propaganda could have achieved. The Germans had been told that the Americans were monsters, but barbarians do not return wedding rings. Barbarians do not distribute chocolate to prisoners. Barbarians do not organize efforts to reunite families. The dissonance between expectation and reality created a psychological rupture that propaganda could not mend. For many Germans, the encounter with American forces was the first crack in the edifice of Nazi ideology, the first moment when they began to question what they had been taught. This was not universal, of course. Many Germans clung to their beliefs, reinterpreting their experiences to fit the narrative they had internalized. Some dismissed American kindness as a temporary facade, a trick designed to extract information or cooperation. Others attributed it to individual anomalies. What followed was not immediate healing, but something quieter and more fragile: stability. Through cooperation between Allied military authorities and humanitarian organizations, systems began to take shape. Camps were reorganized, records were cross-checked, names were written down instead of forgotten. People were counted not as burdens, but as lives temporarily unmoored. Food schedules were regularized, medical care became predictable, children were vaccinated. The chaos did not vanish, but it softened at the edges. For the displaced, this mattered more than grand declarations. Order meant sleep without fear. It meant waking up knowing there would be breakfast. It meant standing in line for paperwork instead of hiding from patrols. These small assurances, repeated day after day, began to restore a sense of time, of past, present, and future, something war had erased. The cooperation extended beyond logistics. Allied authorities allowed displaced persons to organize their own committees, to speak their own languages, to practice their own religions. Schools reopened in tents. Priests, rabbis, and pastors were permitted to serve their communities. Marriages were registered, births were recorded, deaths were acknowledged. Life, halting and imperfect, resumed. This cooperation did not absolve guilt, nor did it erase suffering. It did not undo the crimes of the Reich or the devastation left behind, but it did something else, something equally significant. It rejected the idea that punishment alone could rebuild a shattered continent. It replaced collective condemnation with individual recognition. For people like Marguerite, this cooperation translated into something tangible: a job in the kitchen, a class in a language she did not yet understand, a letter forwarded instead of discarded, a question asked instead of an assumption made. These were not gestures of forgiveness, they were gestures of reconstruction. Slowly, the camps ceased to feel like holding pens and began to resemble temporary towns. People argued, laughed, mourned, planned. They spoke of farms that no longer existed, of houses that might still be standing, of relatives who might still be alive. They learned to imagine futures again, even if those futures were uncertain. This cooperation between former enemies, between soldiers and civilians, between institutions and individuals, became the scaffolding on which post-war Europe would be built. It demonstrated that order need not come from fear, and that authority need not rely on humiliation. It showed that power, exercised with restraint, could stabilize rather than destroy. For the Germans, this was perhaps the most disorienting lesson of all. They had lived under a system that equated control with brutality and unity with obedience. Now they were encountering a different model, one in which cooperation replaced coercion and responsibility replaced blind loyalty. The contrast was impossible to ignore. And while not everyone accepted this lesson, not everyone changed, it remained there, persistent and undeniable, in ration lines, in classrooms, in registration offices, in the simple fact that someone was listening. This was not redemption, it was not absolution. It was something quieter and more demanding, the beginning of accountability paired with the possibility of renewal. A chance, however limited, to rebuild not just cities and economies, but the moral framework that had collapsed alongside them. And for those who had survived long enough to witness it, that cooperation, flawed, incomplete, human, became proof that the world after catastrophe did not have to mirror the world that caused it.